it, getting going along, group and group formal organizations and groups. Um, Group think is this concept that was developed by a scholar by the name of Irving Janis. And this is, with sociology, we're looking at obviously group behavior and patterns in group behavior. And what we know about humans is that we're very tribal, right? We're social animals. We like to belong to a group. And it has a level of conformity to our thought and how we do things, doesn't it? And we like to this rugged individualism, which is encapsulated in the American culture and stuff like this, that the go it alone. But when you peel back the curtain, really, it's this very pattern type of thought and behavior and acting related to the various groups we belong to. So when you look at patterns in group, out group dynamic, dominant group, subordinate group type of stuff, stratified societies and things like that. Something we talked about this. It's been noted for a long time with research is that we don't make rational decisions, do we? Right? Our decisions are based, usually from an emotional, framework. What we believe is what we perceive. Even if truth is knocking on your head, and that looks into how this has evolved, and the intense partisanship and polarization within groups these days, where it just seems to expound on itself, and where there's no middle. So groupthink was this term was by Irving Janis, that was developed, and he looked at U.S. history, politics, and decisions, right, made by people in power and the power elite, especially in areas of militarization and war, right, and occupations. So he looked at patterns of that and thought. And groupthink refers to this kind of one-way tunnel vision, of how a group makes decisions, based in the values of the group, right? How people go along, and a lot of times the research demonstrates that a lot of people go along even though they know it's unwise, right? Max Weber, discussed that a lot in his last lectures, when he made that speech to the University of Munich students, that seemingly good people will go along even at their own expense, right? To go along with the group, right? So you have ideological echo chambers, and people with thought and information, and how that works. And so Janis looked at stuff in Vietnam, for example, right, was something that was very intense, right? And the polarization that happened, and after the Pentagon Papers and stuff like that, and what we know about in from the research, it was just a bad thing, right? And this decision, and people just kept getting escalated into it, and it gets escalating and escalating. Recently, there's a body of research with Afghanistan. I know Travis, right? You're a veteran, you work with veterans. Very powerful book. I listened to him on NPR, he's on PBS. You can look in the Atlantic, I escape his name. That, there was really no direction, and there was a level of groupthink of just going along in Iraq. Janis also looked at groupthink, obviously with politics and irrationality, which we'll look at in a second, but also within corporate decisions, right? Where whistleblowers, or people, the Ford Pinto was one, right? With as corporations grew more powerful, and people were, activists were kind of looking at some of the sketchy things, where they made these cars that were blowing up, and they knew they were going to do that, right? Mary, you probably remember the Ford Pintos, right? They're making millions of dollars, right? People were buying them up, and so that kind of this concept Janice developed and has been brought in to look at this type of stuff. So, we mentioned Max Weber's iron cage, right? And, thought and conformity, and irrationality, the Milgram statement, the Milgram research, the Stanford prison experiment looked at this stuff. If you got a chance to look at Stanley Milgram's lecture TED Talk called The Psychology of Evil, where he looked at prisoner abuse scandals in Abu Ghraib and stuff like that. So how it works, and this is a really cool, whoa, did I lose you? There we go, hold on. I'm going to watch this for a second here. Let me know if you can hear it. Give me a thumbs up here. So here we go. Working all right?
In 2013, a team of researchers held a math test. The exam was administered to over 1,100 American adults and designed, in part, to test their ability to evaluate sets of data. Hidden among these math problems were two almost identical questions. Both problems used the same difficult data set, and each had one objectively correct answer. The first asked about the correlation between rashes and a new skin cream. The second asked about the correlation between crime rates and gun control legislation. Participants with strong math skills were much more likely to get the first question correct, but despite being mathematically identical, the results for the second question looked totally different. Here, math skills weren't the best predictor of which participants answered correctly. Instead, another variable the researchers had been tracking came into play: political identity. Participants whose political beliefs aligned with a correct interpretation of the data were far more likely to answer the problem right. Even the study's top mathematicians were 45% more likely to get the second question wrong when the correct answer challenged their political beliefs. What is it about politics that inspired this kind of illogical error? Can someone's political identity actually affect their ability to process information? The answer lies in a cognitive phenomenon that has become increasingly visible in public life: partisanship. While it's often invoked in the context of politics, partisanship is more broadly defined as a strong preference or bias towards any particular group or idea. Our political, ethnic, religious, and national identities are all different forms of partisanship. Of course, identifying with social groups is an essential and healthy part of human life. Our sense of self is defined not only by who we are as individuals, but also by the groups we belong to. As a result, we're strongly motivated to defend our group identity, protecting both our sense of self and our social communities. But this becomes a problem when the group's beliefs are at odds with reality. Imagine watching your favorite sports team commit a serious foul. You know that's against the rules, but your fellow fans think it's totally acceptable. The tension between these two incompatible thoughts is called cognitive dissonance, and most people are driven to resolve this uncomfortable state of limbo. You might start to blame the referee, complain that the other team started it, or even convince yourself there was no foul in the first place. In a case like this, people are often more motivated to maintain a positive relationship with their group than perceive the world accurately. This behavior is especially dangerous in politics. On an individual scale, allegiance to a party allows people to create a political identity. and support policies they agree with. But partisan-based cognitive dissonance can lead people to reject evidence that's inconsistent with the party line or discredits party leaders. And when entire groups of people revise the facts in service of partisan beliefs, it can lead to policies that aren't grounded in truth or reason. This problem isn't new. Political identities have been around for centuries, but studies show that partisan polarization has increased dramatically in the last few decades. One theory explaining this increase is the trend towards clustering geographically in like-minded communities. Another is the growing tendency to rely on partisan news or social media bubbles. These often act like echo chambers, delivering news and ideas from people with similar views. Fortunately, cognitive scientists have uncovered some strategies for resisting this distortion filter. One is to remember that you're probably more biased than you think. So when you encounter new information, make a deliberate effort to push through your initial intuition and evaluate it analytically. In your own groups, try to make fact-checking and questioning assumptions a valued part of the culture. Warning people that they might have been presented with misinformation can also help. And when you're trying to persuade someone else, affirming their values and framing the issue in their language can help make people more receptive. We still have a long way to go before solving the problem of partisanship, but hopefully these tools can help keep us better informed and capable of making evidence-based decisions about our shared reality. An important tool in fighting echo chambers is learning how to analyze and dissect what you see on the internet and on social media. How good are you at separating fact from fiction? Test your skills with these videos.
Had anyone check that out before I played that in the modules? Yeah, go back there and click on that one and go through that series. It's really good. That was put out by the Heterodox Academy on Open Inquiry. What do you think of that? I'll open it up to you and we'll kind of catapult us into another topic here.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense because being a selfish American human being, I like to think that everyone else is biased but me, but I'll still catch myself all the time.
Yeah.
Being a blue person and then seeing on some Facebook that some red person said this, and I don't even think to question it, even if it's just terrible. I'm like, yeah, of course they did, and then I move on.
Yeah.
And that's definitely some strong internal bias.
What can we do, to do that, to counter that within our own, biases? He made some suggestions in the video.
I think that we need to really stop and think how we're making decisions. Are we making them on the knowledge that we know, or are we making them on our emotions that we know? Are we making them on assumptions that we were taught as children that were handed down from our parents and their aunts and uncles? Just when we make a decision, just where's that decision coming from?
Yeah, but our intuition wants to understand it. It makes us feel good when we have it figured out, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, and but in reality, it's just kind of like, and then we need to go on, right? But it's very kind of corrosive to social relations, isn't it? And society in general. That's a hard thing, and that's one of what Jonathan Haidt causes one of the great untruths of the last 40 years is that you should trust your emotions. What's your gut say on this, Travis? How do you feel about this, right? And what you should be doing is talking back to that, right? or how you, especially when you're discussing politics or anything else dealing with partisanship and stuff like that. But as well as this idea that, the world is divided into good, this dichotomy between good and evil, type of thinking, and it's the studies have shown this type of group behavior is where that negative partisanship they talk about now, where it's just not the other side isn't someone that you disagree with, and then, all right, we take off the gloves and we go have a drink or a cup of coffee and, let's, but, it becomes embedded into your identity, like that video said. And, where studies have shown, heterodox looked at this, is that, the people, see the other side as, dangerous to the country and, the enemy, right? Just very kind of broad generalizations and, not based in any type of. So Travis, you were going to say?
Yeah, if we take a look right now at some of the things we have going on with Afghanistan and the way that whole situation was handled by our government and some of the outrage that's out there, you're looking at a lot of, and I understand a lot of where it comes from on both sides. And it took me a minute, being a military person, to sit down and look at both sides on how this started, where it went, and how quickly it unfolded. But I was very bipartisan. I was very upset at the way a lot of the things went down in Afghanistan and the way everything happened.
In the recent decision, or 20 years ago?
Oh, the recent decision on the way
yeah.
we've handled pulling everybody out and how it wasn't better executed. And if you look back to Vietnam and the Saigon era and everything that happened, it was almost the same way it unfolded, except for we had different helicopters, different. It just wasn't the right plan that was put in place.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad what happened. I mean, and gosh, lives are lost. American and Afghan, and it's easy to yeah. I mean, and what were some of the steps that you did to look at this? Evaluating different sources and things like that.
I know for me, one of the things that I had to go do was go back to the Trump administration, and when he started this, pulling the troops out, there were certain things that were set in motion, certain things that the Taliban was supposed to live up to, certain things that they were supposed to do that weren't upheld on their part.
Yeah.
And when they started doing that, the administration now of Biden, I feel, should have stepped in and said, look, if you're not going to hold up to these standards, these rules that have been set in place, we're not going to go anywhere. But that didn't happen. Yeah. They just went ahead and let the government crumble and backed out and said, there you go, here it is.
It was a quick cut and run. Yeah, I mean, what a mess. So, and this will continue to evolve, I'm sure. And a lot of this, I mean, I was listening to a story on this. A lot of and you probably know this too, the natural resources in that country, he's talking about it. I was listening to a scientist and scholar on NPR talking about, there's like $1 trillion so there's this kind of, corporate agenda setting too. I mean, we know like that we can't be naive about, that type of stuff that often drives this, especially with the military and politics in the last 30 or 40 years, especially the last 40, 50 years, right? With Vietnam and these type of things. I've got a book for you to check out. I know I mentioned a lot of things. I might go over here, but I'll talk to you after class on this. But he's a scholar, kind of an obscure scholar. He's at Wisconsin now, I think, like that. So yeah, I mean, this stuff, and we looked at that last week with Robert Putnam stuff on the uptick and things like that. And so, but the sad thing is this, a lot of this thing and how it encompasses into social policy and decisions, political decisions, military and otherwise, seem to just keep, going on and on. So, will this swing back, to some, I get some of the stuff with groups and wanting to belong, and it's good that people are interested in politics now and care about social change and these type of things, and that's critical to stuff, because it wasn't always that way for a while. So I want to get into deviance here. Where are we? Let's see here. I'm gonna navigate through my thing. Do you see a thing on deviance and social control here? This ties into patterns in group behavior and that type of stuff. You throw logic and all this stuff and it makes no sense, right? So, when we look at deviance, and like I said, this is kind of a special topic paper for you guys to write on your midterm. That we're all deviant, it's a belief, violation of norms or conditions or laws or these type of things, but it's not necessarily what you do, the act itself, Howard Becker said, but it's how society reacts to it and how deviance gets defined. So it becomes relative, right? We're all propelled, to do good or bad. And, sociologists aren't interested in defining, good or bad, as far as when you look at deviance and social control and things like crime and stuff like that. But what, theory or concepts explains, social behavior, social phenomena. So this is important here when you look at deviance and how it's defined. And I'm going to get into a rather kind of lengthy presentation that I gave over the years several different times, discussing some of this stuff when no one was really talking about it. But deviance, and other sociologists, the key to understanding deviance is not, being the moral cop here, but what types of behaviors are being defined as deviant, right? Who's doing the defining? Okay. Generally, how do these things get defined? With deviance.
Typically, deviation is just seen as bad, not really a good thing.
Broadly speaking, how does this come into, and you'll see this in this film. Did anyone look at that film that I have for the midterm essays? Okay. More specifically, structurally, how does this get defined? In one area, it's what?
By society as a whole?
Yeah, collectively, but more specifically within, what institutions, does this get embedded in where you get that collective type of agreement of this is good or bad, or
Talking like governments?
Yeah, who's making the laws, right? Who's determining legislation, right? Institutional practices and societal outcomes are key to understanding this, right, with social policies, right? If you want to change, society, you have to change the institutions. Institutions matter, very much with sociologists, right? And to go broadly with fixing the human condition, because that's why we're all here, right? And as you get more, through college and things like that, that's the whole goal here. It comes from, power structures, people in power. Mass media institutions have a role in this, don't they?
Money, people with money. Because, there's bribes, there's things that are pushed around, people that are paid for certain things. Money has a huge power when it comes to making certain things.
Give me some examples of that.
Politician that accepts money to vote a certain way on a bill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, this is what C. Wright Mills taught, that the revolving door of power, right, with laws. And this was the key to understanding the drug wars and incarceration and policy dealing with trying to fix, a lot with the underclass, right, and inequality and poverty, right, and workers, so. Yeah, I mean, it's throughout the 80s and the 90s, for example, it says 70s really, right? You had politicians getting in front of cameras talking loud about, the scourge of drugs is, going to overtake communities, for drug laws and things like that. Crime and these type of things, all types of behaviors, this type of stuff. And I mentioned Glassner's stuff in a couple weeks ago, I think 2 weeks ago, his book Culture of Fear gets into this, and so it was this kind of governing, body politic was geared towards that, because, you're going towards your base, right? A lot of people are value voters, right? And are motivated by their emotion, whether it's real or perceived, right? And one thing about Glassner's research, he looked at this stuff as crime rates were dropping and dropping and dropping, reporting on it and public policy and politics on it went through the roof, right? And I'll get into that in a little bit of this other lecture in a second. How and why people become deviant, right, is the next question we ask, right? Different opportunity structures will face for people, don't they? Right? What happens, right, when people become deviant? This goes towards going back for a long time, right, with prohibited economies, the underclass, right? For the most part, when people are cut off and alienated, right, from jobs and things like that, where way they can making a meaningful way of life, that is that what Robert Murray called that when they go through that strain with Durkheim kind of Anami, right, when they can't achieve those desired cultural goals, right, a decent job, living in a decent community, your kid in your good school, a lot of people, that have that sense of purpose with work and, having that type of mobility and safety, when that's not there, right, structurally, people resort to that type of stuff. You see this with joblessness. Joblessness is key to understanding, crime and poverty and deviance and these type of things. And then, how society deals with deviance, right? Generally, what you look at in American society, comparatively, public policy and social policy and laws have been geared towards how to deal with deviance, right? Through locking them up, right? Jailing, right? We become the most jailingest society in the world. No one jails like their population like we do. Saudi Arabia, China and Russia and some of these very totalitarian societies are not even close how they deal with deviance, right? So this gets into these things, right? One, what type of behavior is being defined? When you guys write these papers for your midterm essays, think about these 4 points. Who's doing the defining? How and why people become deviant. And you're seeing this with the last 20 years in middle America with job loss, or 30 years, going back to the 90s where we live. Travis, and I know you see that with some of your veterans you work with. So this lecture I've given at different points through the last several years. It's becoming very much a public issue now because of the cost of lives and communities, and the spending on it, with jails and prisons and stuff like that. So looking at this stuff here, so when you look at mass incarceration in relation to the history of the US and drug laws and problems of place and public policy, segregation, public policy like the war on poverty, the war on crime, the era in the 70s with Nixon and the official declaration of the war on drugs. And then throughout the 80s and the 90s, through Reagan and through Bill Clinton. And there's been kind of a lockstep type of thing and steps along the way with different administrations, even up until today. Now, the good thing about this, I'm going to go back to the whole history of this stuff, is that there are starting to be some reform. A lot of the people who are incarcerated are low-level drug offenders, with drug laws and things like that. But this still is, a humongous, system, of around 2.23 million people. So with drug laws, race and history and the drug laws, it's always been, and this is we'll get into the second part of the class with the intersection of race and class, has always been embedded in politics and power structures, right? So the history of drug laws, many of you probably know, have been embedded into, race and class and power, not necessarily, controlling the substance itself. Okay. Racial social control in the white working class was always embedded in that. The first Harrison Act law with opium laws and the Chinese Exclusion Act. In the Harrison Act in 1914, where you had politicians, right, went after that white working class vote, and they went after you had the Chinese, right, immigrant success story, built the railroads, really became prominent members of communities, especially on the West Coast, right? They became the success story, right? Your Chinatowns and all that stuff. Working, paying taxes and all these type of things, starting businesses. And, politicians kind of seized on that and started this type of, that this threatens white workers, right? That, this jobs thing. So what happens is, this was very much embedded in a lot of the xenophobia of the 1920s, right? With the anti-immigrant backlash. Which led to a very, restrictive immigration thing. But so it became this thing where they were locking up Chinese for the opium, right? The habit that they had, even though that drug use and cocaine and marijuana and opium was largely used by. It's always been multiracial, multicultural. But it was largely used by the upper classes. Back then it was very common to have regular substances and things like that. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about this psychological wages, right? Is that what happened was, and Du Bois, famous sociologist, obviously, is this divide between the working class, and it was this kind of race and politics thing that is arguably used to this day in political discourse. And they kind of found a winning combination with that. And it goes back to the Chinese Exclusion Act and dividing the white working class with immigrants and blacks and so forth, and Mexicans and things like that. And so this is where you get like very federal, intervention in drug policy and things like that. So the same thing had happened with cocaine with blacks, right? After post-Reconstruction. Very outlandish type of things, very widely commonly used amongst all populations as it is today. But they use this again to kind of stoke racial irrational fears about, blacks and jobs and things like that. And then the same thing was happening with Mexicans in the marijuana tax law in the 1930s. If you've ever seen this film, there's a propaganda film called Reefer Madness. I kind of looked at that. That Mexicans, it threatened, and their success basically threatened white workers back then. And there was a very kind of social Darwinism type of ethnocentric society back then. And so, you had migration patterns with blacks moving to the northern cities, being recruited, for jobs in factories. You had, Eastern Europeans coming in large groups, especially between 1900 and 1930. Some estimate, I think 80 million had come. And so then you had these urban and social policies geared toward excluding and moving these people into certain areas of the cities, Chicago, which became basically blueprints for modern ghettos and things like that. But there was jobs, right? And the union movement big back then. And so throughout the 1920s, prohibition was a law that was kind of embedded in, especially, Eastern Europeans, this was, and so the bottom drops out in society, right? And in the 1930s, they had to get into social reform, right? And Social Security and these type of things. And to get Southern, racist Democrats on board on this, they had to kind of, the way those laws were written excluded pretty much everybody who wasn't white. The most obvious one was with FHH loans and GI and things like that. Groups were left out of this. Even people, who were veterans, of World War I, were left out of this type of stuff. Different social welfare programs and how they were written in these laws. And so this is where, in the 1950s, with the interstate highway programs and things like that, in the cities, what had happened? You had what we call white flight, right? People started migrating to the suburbs. Industry started moving out of the cities, right? There was a structural transformation with jobs. And so there was a huge structural pattern that happened in the 50s and the 60s. But at this time, there still were jobs, for these people were poor in the cities, but there were jobs, especially with blacks. And at this too, you had redlining and restricted covenants in neighborhood zoning and things like that. And so this kind of led it into these things. And William Julius Wilson looked at this stuff in the 1960s. So what happens? You get the kind of the war on poverty, right? As jobs left the cities, left the whole population of blacks, especially vulnerable to job loss and stuff like that, especially the young population, right? And Kennedy started these big programs with, especially kids in the underclass with, his words, a total attack on delinquency, his committee on juvenile delinquency and youth crime. And this is where sociology was kind of in the golden era. And they, you had, actually people who were PhDs in sociology working in administrations and things like that, and with social policy. And there was some really forward thinking about what to do with poverty, right? Especially the white working class in rural areas, blacks in the cities, rural Appalachia. Michael Harrington writes The Other America. Cloward and Owen's theory, opportunity theory, emphasized, as I hear in this thing, the systematic barriers that contribute to inequalities and crime, right, and job loss. So opportunity structure and illegitimate opportunity theory was embedded in kind of some of the programs. And that's where you had job works and things like that, after school programs, job training, because the factories were gone. They'd left the cities and gone to the suburbs, by 1970. And they wanted to change structurally and provide opportunity structures for especially the underclass in the cities, and the social institutions around them. Because it's just going to be a powder keg of crime, and when people are cut off and jobless, people will go to prohibited economies, right? Just like the Jews did, the Italians did, the Germans did, the Irish did. When they were cut off, and there was a spatial mismatch between jobs and opportunity structures. And so, there is this kind of, forward momentum on this. The country was in the midst of, I mentioned Michael Harrington's book, Kennedy's assassinated. Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, highly influenced LBJ. You had the Office of Economic, the OEA programs. I mentioned the Job Works and the Head Start programs. To address these structural things and to fix it, to institutional practices that fix the societal outcomes, right? Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65, it's passed. They desegregate housing, the redlining and FHH loans, they open up to provide opportunity structures, especially for minority groups at this time. And what happens is you have all full scale now, right? What happening? Social movement, you had huge social movements going on, right? You had a lot of urban uprisings in the 60s, Harlem, Philadelphia, Watts, New York, Chicago. You had college students, you had the Vietnam protests, the feminist movement. There was full scale type of in your face, right? Movements. And policy starts to kind of change. This stuff was all on TV. The Vietnam, was a nightly thing. People are seeing this stuff on TV. Bodies being dragged, the cities are up. Patrick Moynihan wrote a book that looked at this stuff with the impact of job loss and things like that, and poverty as the root cause of crime, right? And putting those opportunity structures in that. And then there was kind of a pushback to all that, which we'll get into in a couple of weeks of all those programs, right? And a lot of the forward momentum of the 60s. And commissions were formed. The Kerner Commission was the first one, and there was one. Maybe it came out in 20 years before that, and they had commissioned a Swedish economist, Gunnar Myrdal. There's a really good book by Mitchell Denier called Ghetto, and gets into a lot of these patterns and things like this in social policies. He's at Princeton right now. And he said essentially, you had one, America split into two societies, one black, one separate, right? And Gunnar Myrdal talked about that, this has become a kind of a white problem. And Du Bois and others had talked about this type of stuff. And so the Moynihan, the Kerner Commission, made recommendations is that basically this fissure in residential segregation, between the suburbs and cities, was basically what Lawrence Bobo called a structural linchpin of American equality, right? This is going to get worse, right? William Julius Wilson, a very famous scholar still around, that the underclass and job and spatial job mismatch. So what had happened were the underclass were kind of locked in the cities, right? When work disappears, right, it opens the door for all types of, deviant behavior, right? And not getting to where the jobs were at, So, the Kerner Commission made several recommendations on this. You probably have heard the Kerner Commission. And so what one of the things I have here was that they looked at these type of things with, especially in ghettos and things like that, and fixing poverty. The pushback to all this now. Questions so far? We're into the 1970s. Makes sense here? Follow me?
I have a question.
Questions so far? That's a lot of information.
I have a question. Did the protest slow down and change because people were tired of the upheaval and the disorder, or did the protesters, did we grow up and realize that we wanted families, we wanted what we had been protesting all those years?
Well, there were so many different social movements, wasn't there?
Oh, yes.
Did people, and that's the what had happened. I mean, that's there's well documented, and it's agreement amongst a lot of scholars, right? There was a pushback to a lot of that stuff. FBI, Contrapolo, they broke up a lot of these programs geared toward fixing, especially Black youth in the cities.
Also, at the same time, didn't some of the laws that they were standing up for change? Didn't some of the bills and things that got passed to reform different things change to where the protests weren't needed anymore?
Yeah,
some of the rights were given.
Right, exactly. There was a lot of, and this is how things happen, and the institutions were changed, right? The laws were changed. I mean, you had Head Start in these programs, social programs of the 60s. But they're at the same time, yeah, definitely, and there's a lot of assassinations, laws had changed. And the movements kind of fissured, sociologists that look at social movements, they split into the feminist movement, the environmental movement, the identity politics came, the 60s generation was very split. The Pentagon papers and Watergate happened. There, a lot of people, were they exhausted? There was efforts in pushing back on the protests, breaking up some of these things. There was laws changed. By the 1980s, a lot of it went away. A lot of these people went into academia. A lot of these some would say some of these activists sold out. It became, like Putman said, more of a me society instead of a we society. Go ahead. Someone was going to say something.
It was me. I was just going to say a lot of, like, we were talking about, like, why the protesters, why it started to kind of subside. There was a lot of like during some of the protests, especially amongst like college campuses and stuff, there was a lot of like military that was dispersed, like if we look at the Kent State massacre,
Yeah,
and then
Kent State was horrible.
there was a massacre also. I want to say it was Jackson State, in Mississippi.
Mhm.
And then there was also another, but I think a fear kind of controlled a lot of that too before laws started changing. The fear was kind of instilled in a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
there
know
was,
that's very heavy, but I was just thinking, I just listened to a really awesome podcast the other day just about that whole thing, and it's just fresh on my mind.
yeah. Well, race and class has always been embedded into politics. This is a whole, gosh, class on this. Um, Northern whites don't buy into the civil rights movement. Okay. Denier talks about it's well documented as blacks moved into suburban areas. They're seeing all this stuff on TV. And that there was kind of a blowback, and then a whole politics of courting what they call the Southern strategy, right? And has anyone heard of the Southern strategy? It was used by Nixon to court. Listen to the Atwater tapes, right? Lee Atwater was a Republican strategist. They try and court these former, right, kind of Southern Dixiecrats, right, kind of racist type of Southerners, and going after that middle America, that white vote. And Nixon, basically, what had happened, there was kind of a blowback to that stuff, but it's kind of like NIMBY. You've heard that term, NIMBY. So there was a redesign of the social structure with residential segregation and things like that, So Nixon, in the 11th hour, basically get poll number up, use this kind of crime fighting rhetoric, where they officially, where he declares drug use public enemy number one, right? And this crime fighting type of law and order rhetoric that Democrats and Republicans found as a winning combination. As you guys probably know, you had Rockefeller drug laws and things like that. At the same time, you had huge job losses in the 1970s and the 80s, okay? Especially as globalization speeds up, the economy was kind of teetering much of that time, with inflation and things like that. Mary?
Yeah, we're talking about fear. For me, it wasn't so much a fear of what was happening. It was, I became aware that the government didn't always tell me the truth. I became aware that the violent actions were not getting anywhere. They were just causing more violence on more violence. That there had to be a different way to go about making change.
Well, another factor too, I mentioned it's pretty much agreement. Northern whites don't buy into the gains of the civil rights movement and things like that, especially the middle and upper classes. But also, what had happened too was a very deep distrust in government, right? There was a Netflix series called "Who Killed Bobby Kennedy." You had King. You had, Bobby Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin King. All these people. You had Vietnam. people, dying, the lotteries, people, the kids going to war, the Vietnam consensus on that was just split between, right, people who were, and, after Watergate, that type of stuff, and joblessness, and, the 1970s was pretty much economic stagnation, wasn't it? You guys know from history, you're too young to remember. High inflation. But, you had this kind of crime fighting type of rhetoric where poverty was racialized, right? Not just Blacks and Latinos, but also white, working class, poor, right? Louis Wolcott wrote a book called Prisons of Poverty, right? Where so poverty becomes criminalized, you see. And Nixon found that this was the Southern strategy was a winning combination. And so you had politicians getting in front of cameras talking about, lock them up, this kind of crime fighting rhetoric. And yeah, there was a spike in some crime, things like that. From 1980 is where it really kicks in with Reagan, and they have very racially coded rhetoric. I mentioned the Atwater tapes he used to get him elected. Recast really the war on drugs, at a time when, at the same time with Nixon, only 2% of the population saw drugs as a serious national concern, right? But they kind of reformulated, what Nixon had started, especially to go after that white working class vote, which is very important, as you guys know today, especially that upper Midwest, those swing states. They did it back when the Harrison Act with the Chinese and back in, especially in the Western states. There was a whole media offensive, with this. It was just night after night, really crazy stories about drug users and crime, and it was gonna overtake communities. And at the same time, you had increased funding and things like that. Crack cocaine hits the street at the same time joblessness happens. This crazy outrageous story about drug users and things like that, super predators, and all this stuff just becomes racialized with job loss at the same time, especially in the cities, right? The cities, you had budgets cut drastically. You've probably seen things on New York at the time. They basically they were crumbling, right, throughout the 80s, and there was a huge recession. Reagan's trying to kickstart the economy, but this whole kind of thing was kind of redesigned at different administrations. Martin Gillen's research looked at this type of stuff in his book Why Americans Hate Welfare. So it was just a kind of thing to recast poverty and again, criminalizing poverty, and basically scapegoating and othering, poor people. Huge sociological studies done by William Julius Wilson at the University of Chicago on this. His book and his studies, When Work Disappears, and looked at deindustrialization and ghettos and huge changes in the economy. Where in the 70s, you had 70% of Blacks in metro areas had blue collar jobs. By 1987, it was down to 28%. You had drugs and joblessness hit at the same time. Now keep this in mind, right? This is 1987 going into 1990. Joblessness, right, and addiction, right, sweep over these large populations, largely of men, right, joblessness in men. Clinton, right, doubles down on all this type of stuff, right? Political opportunism is key to understanding the incarceration, the war on drugs. Law enforcement budgets explode. during this time. You had billions of dollars of grants going to lock up low-level drug offenders. The sentencing project looked at this type of stuff. He really kind of just doubles down on the conservative stuff. In '94, he sends, right, when we think about like legislation going, wow, $1 trillion, right? When he signed into law a $30 billion crime bill, to flood in local and state things, and 3 strike laws, things like that. Prison population is just going up. At the same time, same thing happened in the 70s and the 80s with what Julius Wilson talking with the Black working class. Now the same thing is happening with the white working class, right? In the 90s, joblessness, right? NAFTA, jobs go away in middle America. And what at the same time, what do you have? Huge seismic changes in middle America, okay? Amongst the white working class. This is where meth, by 2000, the pharmaceutical drugs, the opioids and things like that are just all over the place. And so these groups, and there's even old commercials you might remember about meth heads and things like that, trailer trash, whites and things like this. So they're being racialized, right, the same way other Blacks were at the same time. And by the end of the Clinton era, you had just huge spending on prisons and things like that. And some say, well, I guess that's a whole different story, the last couple of elections. But moving Clinton's a whole thing. So there were these huge 171% increase in corrections in prison. 61%, 17 billion was slashed from public housing and subsidies for the poor during that administration. They gutted welfare in '96. And then you have the militarization of police, through this time, as military, things were coming in. The Cato Institute looked at this, and some of these things, things with that you see today, and huge job losses in the 2000 in middle America. The downtowns and the cities, we live in this type of thing. You had huge job skilling. Opioids, you had when you look at there's a lady by the name of, what's her name? It's called Dope Sick is the name of the book. I think I put a talk with her that looked at this stuff, the effects of the white working class in rural areas where heroin comes back. So it's, like we say in social science, it was the perfect storm, addiction, and this stuff just escalates, during the 2000s and on up to today, where you have still, the cost with federal prison. You had 700% increase in the prison population, where you have 1 in 8 state employees now are in some type of corrections. The spending on this type of stuff as far as prison terms and things like that. There are reforms, even though we have Republicans and Democrats who are on the same board with kind of creating this problem structurally. And now there's, that's one thing they do agree on, is ending this, right? It's just because it's just a big money pit, tax dollars. The Chronicle of Higher Education found that there were like 13 states now that spend more on prisons than they do on higher education throughout America. You know, I mentioned the math and the addictions. I mean, before the pandemic hit, I think there were like 70,000 ODs a year. And you see where these were largely based, you know, in middle America, where the job loss. You see this. We all know about the pharmaceutical industry and that type of stuff. You know how that kind of happened. So, here we are today, and it's still, a huge problem with addiction. A lot of the stuff I've read and, scholars I've heard on this, you'll see him in this movie. There's a lot of heavy scholars and academics. You'll see William Julius Wilson in that film. You'll see a guy by the name of Carl Hart. He's at Columbia that looked at that type of stuff. It's still it's expected to be, I think in the next 5 years, another 400 or 500,000 deaths from it. In one study I saw, in the next 10, definitely the 500,000. And it's just worse, and it's kind of the social isolation and alienation now. And opportunity structures are really embedded in them. The pandemic just popped this stuff open again, didn't it? Addicts who needed to go to meetings, 12-step programs and stuff like that happened. So this is kind of public policy, social policy, deviance, addiction, all this type of stuff. And I hope this make kind of coherent sense to you. And I want to kind of open it up for all of you, because I know this is something that's affect all of us probably in this class today. And we're really in, middle of the heartbeat, what do they call it? The heartland, really where this stuff, where the deindustrialization, this stuff, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, all these areas where it's bad. Joblessness is the key to understanding deviance, crime, and addiction, and things like that, right? When people are cut off and alienated, Emil Durkheim talked about that in his studies on suicide. Suicide rates have skyrocketed since the 2000s. Amongst males, it's up 75%. Amongst females, it's up 25%. I know some of this hits close to home for you guys. I know it does for me as well. So questions on, I want to open this up for discussion. Questions, analysis.
I don't have a question. I just find it very fascinating that I'm living my life again. all these things that I lived through, and I'm getting a new appreciation for how serious everything was.
Yeah. Some of you probably are in human services too, so you're that applied type of sociology, criminal justice majors too. It's becoming, it's becoming, it's trending, if you will. For a long time, I've given this, have had a special unit and papers on this for the last 20 years when I was teaching. I mean, it really just kind of came into being where there was kind of a consciousness about these things in the last 5 or 6 years, really, I would argue. Other
We go back and talk about like the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter.